The Brightline from South Florida to Orlando is officially open, but is this the fastest way to get from South Florida to Orlando or Orlando to South Florida? In this video, we're going to dive into that along with what in the world is the Brightline, what are these prices looking like, what's the experience like, and a couple reasons why the Brightline just probably doesn't make sense to take right now. Okay, but Joe, what in the world is the Brightline? So the Brightline is South Florida's high-speed rail system. Well, I guess now Florida's high-speed rail system. So it does pretty much operate right now in South Florida specifically, and they're now on September 22nd finally opening the Orlando station at MCO. So right now there's a couple stations here in South Florida. So there's one in downtown Miami, there's one in Aventura, then there's one in Fort Lauderdale, then there's one in Boca at Meisner Park, and then West Palm, and then this newest station in Orlando at MCO. And honestly, it is a great way to get around South Florida because there's a ton of traffic. I mean, it's a lot quicker to take the Brightline. So you can go from downtown Miami to Aventura in about 15 minutes, downtown Miami to Fort Lauderdale in about 30 minutes, Fort Lauderdale to Boca about 15 minutes, and then Fort Lauderdale to West Palm in about 30 minutes. Okay, that's awesome. It's a great way to get around. And one of the best parts is all these places that the train station is in South Florida is extremely walkable. So that's something that's extremely important to remember when we start talking about the Orlando station. Speaking of the Orlando station, Miami to Orlando, it says it's going to take about 3 hours and 33 minutes to 3 hours and about 40 minutes. If you drive from Miami to MCO, it's going to take you about 3 hours and 15 minutes all the way up to 4 hours. So that's another thing to think about when we start talking about why the Brightline just might not make sense. But honestly, being able to take the train from Miami to Orlando or Orlando to Miami does make a lot of sense because you could actually sit there, get some work done. You don't have to sit in traffic. There's a lot of different things you can do. Plus you can just relax and hang out. I mean, it is kind of an experience in and of itself. It's not like you're using it to commute back and forth. It's not like, I mean, I could definitely see people doing this, living in Orlando, commuting to Miami for work when they have to go in the office 1 or 2 times a week, because it is a lot more affordable to live in Orlando than to live in South Florida. I could also see it kind of vice versa. If they want to live in South Florida, commuting to the office 1 to 2 times a week in Orlando, and that would also make sense. So that's where I can kind of see some of the viability of this. But now let's also talk about kind of what's happening with the Brightline moving forward. So right now, like I said, the only station north of South Florida is that Orlando MCO station. But they are also adding new stations. The entire plan is to go from pretty much Miami to Tampa. So the next 2 stations in the works are there's going to be a station right near the Orange County Convention Center. They wanted to do it near downtown Disney, or when was downtown Disney, now called Disney Springs, but there's just a lot of hoops, a lot of hurdles. Obviously, the state of Florida was battling with Disney at that time, and they just decided to scrap that plan and now go to the convention center. Honestly, I think the convention center route's a little bit better. I think there's a little bit more opportunity. You have a lot more people coming into town to go to the convention center who might possibly take the train, especially to go back and forth to the airport. Seems a lot more viable. But one of the other things to think about is the convention center is actually close to Universal. So now it'll be interesting to see how it plays out between Disney and Universal, and vying for people who are taking the train, who are flying into MCO from out of state. Now they're going to the theme parks, and how that whole conundrum is going to play out. From there, the next station is to go to Tampa. So you'll go MCO, then to the convention center, and then to Tampa. And honestly, that's probably the most exciting part, because if you're going to drive from Miami to Tampa, you're looking at about 3.5 to 4 hours, depending on traffic. So it's not the worst drive in the world. It's also not the most fun drive in the world. But if you could be able to take the train, it makes it so much easier. Think about it. You can go on a long weekend. You can leave on a Friday night, take the train. You can go all the way to Tampa, or you can go to Orlando. It does open up a lot of possibilities there as well. Right now, there's about 6 trains that are running nonstop from Miami to Orlando and vice versa. So this first one leaves at 6:40 a.m. and then the last one leaves at 8:40 p.m. So if you're doing something, you get done at 9 o'clock, you are screwed. You're gonna have to stay, either get a hotel room, crash with someone, Airbnb, something like that. So that's where I could also see them adding more trains to the schedule, or maybe even a more late night train. It would make a little bit more sense. But then again, the Brightline doesn't run 24/7. Most of the time, the latest train that runs down here in South Florida is one that runs right around like a heat game or a sporting event, concert, something like that. Those are more so the later trains. So that's another kind of flaw of it that I can possibly see right now in the beginning, but we'll also see how it plays out. Okay, so now let's talk about the pricing. In South Florida, the prices are obviously a lot cheaper because the routes are a lot shorter. So you can get about a one-way ticket for as low as $6.50, and that's if you book in advance. Think of it like anything else. You book the same day, it's gonna be more expensive. On average though, you're looking at about $15 to $20 for the business class, and about $30 to $45, depending on the time and all that stuff, obviously, the premium one-way. Now, on the flip side of that, when we're talking about the Orlando to Miami, Miami to Orlando train, one way, lowest ticket price right now is $79, and that's the business class, and then upwards for the premium of all the way up to $229 just one way for one person. So then obviously you're gonna have to get back. We're looking at anywhere between, on the low end, about $158, and then on the much higher end, you'd be almost upwards of $300. So that's where we're kind of thinking like, hey, does it still make sense to be able to take the train, do things like that? Because obviously you're gonna have to get back. Another thing to think about is the train schedule. So right now, obviously the Brightline doesn't run 24/7 here in South Florida. It's not gonna run 24/7 going back and forth to Orlando. So right now there's only 6 trains that are available. The first one does leave pretty early, about 6:40 in the morning. And then the last one does leave at 8:40, I think, p.m. So it gives you a nice window to get stuff done. But think about it, if you get done, or you get done with a game or show in either market, Miami or Orlando, and you don't get there till after 8:40, you're screwed. You're gonna have to stay, either get a hotel room, rent a car, fly back, Airbnb, hang out with a buddy. So that's another thing to think about. And in South Florida, I mean, the only time we really do have late trains are when there are events. So sporting events like heat games, concerts, things like that. It does give a little bit more flexibility. It'll be interesting to see if we get a later train with the Brightline going to Orlando. But right now we don't see it. I kind of went through all the schedule. Don't see any right now, but that's not to say that it could change. I'd also like to see them maybe add a couple more trains, but as things progress, I'm pretty sure that'll happen. But it's just also something to keep in mind, kind of looking at it and seeing, does it make sense right now to take as well? Speaking of making sense to take right now, let's kind of talk about the reasons, like I said, of why taking the Brightline just doesn't really make sense for you and or your family. So number one, obviously, has to be the prices. So let's think about it. You're going one way, one person. Let's just call your price $79. It's gonna take you from Miami to Orlando. If you're gonna drive, on average, depending on what car you drive, it's gonna maybe cost you to fill up $50 to $100. But now let's think about this. Now you get to your destination in Orlando, you're at the airport. You're not in Orlando. Like, you still have to either take an Uber, drive, have a buddy pick you up to get to like downtown Orlando or wherever you are going in Orlando. So that price isn't just $79. It's $79 plus the Uber ride, plus the meal you gotta buy your friend for picking you up, or plus the car rental once you do get to MCO. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The next thing I would talk about with the Brightline not really making sense is the walkability, like I was saying. MCO is kind of out there. You're really just near Lake Nona, and you're really not in Lake Nona either. You can't just leave the airport and walk to Lake Nona like you can at some of these stations here in South Florida. South Florida, you get dropped off downtown in Miami, you can walk to the Heat game from that station. You could walk to downtown. You could walk to Brickell if you really wanted to, but you could take the Metro Mover. So there's a little bit more options. You get dropped off at the Aventura Mall, pretty much, at the Aventura station. So you can walk across the street to the Aventura Mall. In Fort Lauderdale, it drops you off downtown like in Miami. You can walk to everything. In Boca, it drops you off in Meisner Park. You could walk to Meisner Park, shopping, dining, everything you want to do. And then in West Palm, it drops you off in downtown West Palm where you can walk to everything. So that's where it's kind of like an issue in Orlando. It drops you off at the airport. What are you going to do there? You're going to have to do something else? Get another ride? Figure that out. So that's an issue in and of itself. Next is the time it takes. So like I was saying before, it says it's going to take about 3.5 hours, 3 hours and 45 minutes. If you drive from downtown Miami to the airport, we're not saying to downtown Orlando, it's going to take you about 3 hours and 15 minutes, upwards of 4 hours with traffic. But you could probably make it quicker if you drive fast. I mean, that's if you're driving the speed limit. A lot of people, let's be real, you ever been out on 95 on the Turnpike here in Florida? This speed limit sign is a suggestion, it seems like. People are flying. So if you drive like that, you could definitely make it a lot quicker. But on the flip side, I could see where you're sitting on the train, you could get some work done, you're not sitting in traffic. There's not an accident, because it seems like there's always an accident on 95 and the Turnpike, especially on that route going from Miami to Orlando. So that's another thing to think about. Does it make sense? Are you trying to get stuff done, or are you just trying to get up there? And then I would say probably the last reason it might not make sense, which we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, is the schedule. So you are kind of at the Brightline's mercy of the schedule. Like I said, first train's at 6:40, last train's at 8:40. So if you have anything to do late at night, you're gonna have to find somewhere to stay because there's not a midnight train that takes you back, unless there's an event. However, I could see the Brightline making sense for this one reason. if you're going from Orlando to South Florida, I definitely see the Brightline making a lot more sense, especially right now in the beginning. I think once everything starts to transition, they build more stuff out for the Brightline in both like going to the convention center in Tampa, it will make a lot more sense going from South Florida upwards to Central Florida. But right now, people in Orlando are the ones lucking out. They can go park at MCO, take the Brightline down, and then they can go pretty much go and explore all of South Florida in a day if they want to, and still make it back by 8:40. I mean, it doesn't give them a whole lot of time, but it drops them off everywhere that's walkable. They can do everything. And that's where it really makes sense right now. Like I was saying though, it will make sense going forward, but it just depends on your situation too. So let me know in the comments down below. Do you think the Brightline right now makes sense to go to Orlando, or do you think it makes more sense to go from Orlando to South Florida? And if you're looking to buy or sell anywhere here in the state of Florida, or you just have questions about anything here in the state of Florida, my team and I would love to be your real estate resource of choice. You can email me, joe@theveragroup.com, or call or text me.